All right. So, welcome. And we've already introduced ourselves, so we're just going to skip right along to the next to the next slide. So, the reason we are all here is because we understand the importance of disability ministry. But as Macrina mentioned, one of the biggest hindrances to starting a ministry is the thought patterns of people within the church. And so there's this pervasive idea that somehow people who have disabilities are considered not entirely whole, perhaps even less than, and that unless you're completely able-bodied, you're not able to worship as other do or live life in the same way. And that mode of thinking, we obviously all understand, is incorrect. It's not a celebration of diversity, but instead enforces a theology of assimilation. So those of us who are on this webinar have a pretty good handle on this, but this sort of thinking is what you're going to encounter with people in your churches, and it will be a hindrance to making people feel welcomed and accepted. When we sent out the webinar notice, we had mentioned that roughly 80% of those people, or people living with disabilities, tend not to come to churches, mostly because they feel unwelcome. And that is definitely one of the biggest hindrances that you're going to deal with as you begin working through this ministry. Not out of, any malice, but simply because people are expressing these things that have been ingrained in them throughout the years. So one of the books that we had come across, one of the things that we had come across was this book by Amy Kenny. She has a book called My Body Is Not a Prayer Request. And one of the things that she would come up with or would notice was that people would ask to pray for her because somehow her body needed fixing. And she would tell them no. And then they would tell her, if you don't accept my prayer, you are rejecting God's provision for you. And if she offered to pray for others, they got offended because they don't need any healing because I'm not disabled. And so, she very strongly in her book talked about how there's this pervasive view of within parishes where everyone seems to think that in order to be fully engaged in ministry or fully engaged in the worship of the church, you need to somehow not have any kind of physical limitations, mental limitations, anything of those natures. And so that is a book that I would recommend if any of you are willing to go through it. So some personal examples. One of the things that I encountered, we all know that the Episcopal Church has a statement in the canons that states our non-discrimination policy. So my personal experience with some of this was that at one point I was sitting in a wheelchair at one of the conventions, and I was also in the process of holy orders, and one of the people on the comm looked at my wheelchair, looked back at me and said, well, I really hope that's not permanent. And so I said, okay. I don't know what they meant by it, but because we weren't able to have a further conversation, what I took it to mean was if I want to pursue holy orders, I should not have any kind of physical limitations. I should not have a disability of any kind. And so the following year, I was diagnosed with relapsing remitting MS. And so I made sure that I never told the comm that information. And I felt like I wasn't being completely honest with the comm, but because I felt that they had made it very clear to me what they thought, I never went about doing that. And so all that to say that sometimes the comments that we make, all of us make, can affect people slightly differently than we think that it's going to affect them. And it just kind of brings about this information. So here I am, I'm ordained, wonderful church we work for. However, we continue to make mistakes. Just recently, we have a litany of healing service here at St. Albans. And I realized after 8 months of using this litany that we have a phrase that says, a prayer that prays that those with disabilities will be made whole, which again emphasizes this idea that somehow you're not entirely whole if you have a disability. And so that I will be correcting that as soon as I can. So Wynn would like to share a bit.
Well, of course, my experience was this. My experience, and I was coming from a Catholic background, and I was coming from a smaller church in Aspen, Colorado. Now, granted, smaller church in Aspen, Colorado was my mom's second home church. Believe it or not, fun facts that my mom's home church where I was baptized. So my home church is a small church in Nassau, Bahamas. So to give you some context, there, we're talking about a small church, St. Mary's Catholic Church in Aspen, Colorado. And I had the unfortunate privilege of having the priest say to me as church let out, he goes, "How's your mom? Where's your mom?" And I said, as calmly as I could, "She's passed away." And he said to me, "How nice. How nice." And I am sitting in my wheelchair, or maybe, no, I was on a walk at the time. And so I was thinking, you just said, "How nice." You should have said, "How can we help you?" You're now motherless. You're now starting to become an orphan. Well, long story short, my dad died. My dad, who was atheist, God love him, died in 2019. And so I decided after that he died that I wasn't going back to church at all. Well, moved down to Arizona in 2021 and start soul searching journey, starting with my own soul searching and then doing spiritual work. I believe it or not, I am on a bus. I'm on a bus coming home from Ability 360, and God has now put in my heart. I'm in my driveway at this point. He's put it in my heart. You need to find a home church. So I'm like, okay, God, I'll try and he's persistent about it. You need to find a home church. Mentions that in my heart 10 times. You need to find a home church. You need to find a group that loves you and supports you. So I'm like, okay. So then, long story short, I try MCC, which, for those of you that don't know, I am gay. And so what MCC is a church for the gays. Well, OMCC was in the Lutheran Church in downtown Phoenix. And needless to say, I didn't feel safe as a woman with cerebral palsy. Forget cerebral palsy. As a woman in downtown Phoenix, waiting for the bus outside a Lutheran church, and they didn't they didn't take it well that Win was a little loudmouth, and MCC didn't take it well that Win was a little loudmouth and asked all the questions in the world. And so I'm thinking, okay, been there, done that. What am I going to do? And I still have this thing on my heart that I need to find a home church. So what do? I get so dang angry after MCC, plus I don't feel safe waiting for a bus at MCC. I said, okay, I'm going to Google Episcopal churches because at the time when my mom died, I had a friend working with the Episcopal church back east. So the Episcopal churches have always been welcome. So, of course, I went to the church that was welcome. And so, unbeknownst to me, when I Googled Episcopal churches, St. Barnabas on the Desert showed up on Google Maps. So, little old me takes paratransit up to St. Barnabas, has no clue that this is going to be my home church, gets off the bus, figured out where, somehow figured out where to go, and falls in love with it. Falls in love with it. And for those of you that don't know, we have a mosaic it's a huge mosaic, and of Birds of Paradise. Well, Birds of Paradise is my favorite flower, so I'm like, nice. They have my favorite flower behind the organ. And so I fill out one of those welcome cards. And at the time, our priest, Jim, was there, and Jim's last name escapes me, but at the time, our priest, Jim, was there. He's since retired. We have a new interim rector, but I fill out the welcome card. So I'm thinking, well, if I fill out this welcome card, they're going to call me back. So I put the welcome card in the basket, like you're supposed to do. The good new Episcopalian puts the welcome card in the basket. And so St. Barnabas doesn't call me back. And so I come to find out that Miss Jennifer Reddle, is coming up to St. Barnabas to do holy baptism and holy confirmation. So what do? I sign myself up for then the Episcopal way, and I'm like, well, this is great. So then in April of 2023, I became Episcopalian, and needless to say, they they had me in the center of the room, which unfortunately you saw me. You didn't. You saw the stage. You didn't. You saw me. So So my experience is just keep showing up, and then somehow you'll be welcomed into the church. And I'm such a loud mouth. I'm surprised Jennifer, both my Jennifers still love me. And I'm surprised you guys still love me because I'm such a loud mouth that I don't shut up about disability rights. So that's how I landed up at St. Barnabas.
Well, thank you, Wynn. And Denny, would you care to share quickly about
Sure.
experience?
Well, for the last 25 plus years, I've been living with an autoimmune disease that causes extreme dry eye, dry mouth, GI issues, and chronic fatigue. On top of this, during the COVID epidemic, I came down with the West Nile virus, which which caused encephalitis. I was left with balance issues, memory problems, double vision, and speech problems. I am glad that I have the technology, importantly, video conferencing, for me to continue service to the church and diocese. I am lucky that I am not, when I'm just standing or sitting or not talking, most people would not realize that I have a disability. However, when I share with others, I often get the comment, "Oh, you don't look disabled."
Now, we only share these stories with you because, just to remind you, and I know that all of you probably, because you're on this call in the first place, understand that there's this ingrained thinking that you will have to encounter. And so it's very important that you'll need to work against that with the training and with sermons, and especially by example. So that brings us to where to start. So this is what we're really here for, isn't it? Where do we even begin with a ministry? And so first, throw out the idea that disability ministry automatically means a new program. It does not necessarily mean a new program. It's not another expense for the church. It's not a ministry to those living with disabilities. It's not a ministry for those living with disabilities. Instead, it's a ministry with those living with disabilities. And it usually just means get creative with the funding and resources you already have. So the only thing a ministry to those living with disability needs is they need to experience the good news of Jesus Christ and experience beloved community inside your doors. And all that really means is accessibility, a way to get there, and acceptance. So accessibility is as simple as scanning your physical structure, and you can figure out where things are inaccessible. One good way to do that is to maybe take a walker or take a wheelchair if you are not usually using those, and see where you can go in your church to discover what is accessible, what is not accessible. You can also do things like wearing earmuffs to see how well you can hear. When you have issues with hearing, and if your space has a lot of reverberations, that will give you an idea of what's going on. However, acceptance, this is more complex, as we just shared with our stories, because so accessibility is easy. Acceptance is a learning curve for both parishioners and clergy alike. Which then brings us to the question of asking. The Episcopal Church catchphrase is "all are welcome." And so the first question you should ask is, where are you already meeting the needs of all people? If you go through all your ministries, from Sunday morning worship to Wednesday evening Bible study to Friday Eucharist or anything in between, ask yourself, are we meeting the needs of all people who are coming there? And be honest with yourself. How easy would it be for someone living with a disability to attend and fully participate in this activity? A lot of times we assume that because people can make it, they're all fully participating. But if people are, if it's held in a room with a lot of background noise, people who have hearing issues might not be able to fully participate. If it's held in a room upstairs, people are not going to be able to fully participate. So be completely honest with yourself and understand The next question you have to ask is, are the clergy on board? Now, this webinar is geared towards clergy, but if you are not the rector, vicar, or priest in charge, this question is important, because without clergy support, ministries lose steam. If it's important to the clergy, it's important to the parishioners. And if your clergy is not on board, ask them why. So ask yourself, who is going to be the volunteer, the coordinator? Who has the drive, the passion, and the desire to coordinate all the ministries with the needs of those living with disabilities? This should never be the rector, vicar, or priest in charge. It should not be expected of those living with a disability. If they want to be, great, but you should not expect them to do this. If they want to do it, that's wonderful. It should be someone who knows all the ministries of your church and coordinate the changing needs of those living with disabilities with the ministry heads, and then coordinate involvement of all those who are attending, those who are volunteering, and those who are leading. Of course, ask God, because prayer changes things, and ask God to provide the people for this ministry, and ask God to provide, the wisdom as you move forward. And the most important ask, of course, I'll hand this off to Denny.
Okay. The most important thing is to ask your target audience. The biggest fear that people with disabilities have is that they will be seen as whiny, ungrateful, or demanding. They will be less likely to come to you asking for support because they have experienced rejection, side-eye, or complaining from those that they have asked. And who really wants to be through that repeatedly? Some sample questions. What have you experienced, not just in this church, but in other churches, that made you feel welcome and accepted? What didn't work? How have you experienced hurt and rejection, both in the church and other churches? What drove you away from the greater church? What has something you experienced that was so egregious that you felt like God did not want you around? All questions that you come up with on your own should be open-ended. This will allow the person who you are speaking with to interpret your question as they see fit. You will find a lot of information you may not have been expecting if you do not do this, or miss things that you ask or miss things if you ask specific questions that assume too much. Remember also, these questions should be made with the whole family, not just the person living with a disability. Excuse me. Just a second. Not just the person living with a disability, especially those who have family, who have children, or are caretakers for their siblings, parents, or other members of their family. In some cases, the questions may only be able to be made to the family members. Remember, when you ask these questions, you're not trying to become a fully fledged social program. Your community has social programs available to those in your church who are living with a disability. You might simply need to make them aware of these services if they don't already know about them. Your goal is to become a place where people with disabilities can experience spiritual nurture. All that is required is accessibility to fully participate in the ministries they wish to engage in, and a welcoming attitude by you and all those in your parish.
So one of the questions that will come up is, what if you would like to start a ministry with people who are living with a disability, but you don't have anyone in your church at the moment? Well, what you need to know is people know people. And one good way to get information as to why no one is coming to your church is to have those people, the people that are in your church, if they know somebody who's living with a disability, ask them to ask these questions for you, and to go to their neighbors and ask these questions so that they can find out why it is that they don't go to church, or why they might not be coming to your church. And then you can allow yourself to make any changes that would be welcoming to those people who may wish to come but have not yet found a church home. So one of the things is that the church's stated goal from the pulpit or in other forms of communicating, of meeting the needs of those people who prefer not to come to church, will help these people who have neighbors begin thinking more clearly about inviting their neighbors who might be living with disabilities. And so as long as, if you are a priest, make sure that you are continually preaching inclusivity from the pulpit, and making people aware, by word and example. And so then people who have neighbors who are living with disabilities, they will start thinking about those questions and may begin having those conversations that you are hoping to have. And then you can hopefully begin a ministry with people living with disabilities. So making sense of what you heard. It might seem like common sense to ask these questions to your target audience, but oftentimes out of sight, out of mind is a real thing. When you go to the people, again, remember that many of them will not come to you because they've experienced rejection in other churches, and so they may not come to you with their concerns or with their needs. And so we need to go and ask the questions. And when we go and listen to them, we need to make sure that listening is all we are doing. Listening is all we are doing. The stories that we might hear might make us angry. They might bring us to tears. And we may be tempted to drop a nuclear bomb of accessibility, or be tempted to do everything all at once. But we need to just stop and listen, because what we're really trying to hope is finding out the most important needs, and then we will tackle one or two items at a time. If you are not clergy, also make sure to ask and listen to what might be keeping the clergy at your church from fully engaging in this vital form of evangelism and welcome. And if you are not clergy, also be prepared to volunteer. That's just a reminder. So getting all your ducks in a row. Once you have asked the questions and heard the biggest needs in your church, start small. You may have noticed that the Disability Concerns Committee, we sent out a survey, and then we picked the top results and began working on those issues. That's the same thing that you would do in your church. Figure out your target audience, what their needs are, pick the top concerns, and then start small. Start with the immediate and practical needs, and again, be creative with your existing resources. It doesn't necessarily mean you need to throw money at it. However, if you do have extra money, putting resources toward accessibility will go a long way to making people feel welcome and accepted. There are multiple ways of dealing with issues for people who have hearing issues. One of the things that we were able to do here at St. Albans it's, you know, it's the quickest way and the cheapest way of allowing people to hear. We bought a little program or a little a router that essentially takes everything from the microphones, pipes it through people's phones, and puts it into, you know, their earbuds or their etc. There is a ever so slight delay, and some people cannot handle it. However, those people who really have true hearing loss have found it to be an incredible blessing, because now they can actually hear. And so for those who have, you know, a little bit of hearing loss, it causes them some consternation. For those who have considerable hearing loss, it's been a life changer. One person said, it's like I'm coming to a completely different church. I mean, it's a new church service. So, you know, if you have a little bit of money, putting a little bit of money can go a long way to making people feel welcome and accepted. The other thing is, you know, the volunteer coordinator, if they can connect those willing to serve with those needing the service, like rides, respite, or cleaning, that is something that you can do that doesn't involve any kind of money, and it's a very small step in getting yourself situated and prepared. For long-term planning, run everything through the question of how can we include people with disabilities in our existing programs. And honestly, if you ask that one question, it's really hard to go wrong. And so with every ministry you have, how can we include people with disabilities in this particular ministry or program? And if that's the only question you ask, you really can't go wrong. You'll get creative and find ways of making it possible. And with long-term planning, you're going to include people with their existing needs. For most, existing needs never change, but for some people, they will change. And so you will need to plan accordingly, knowing when you may need to change going forward. So some proven models of ministry. These can go a long way to helping those living with disabilities and their families without any additional funds. So some proven systems are the buddy system. But parents and siblings should never be buddies, and you should not expect them to be. So that is one thing you'll want to make sure. Self-contained instructions for children or youth in formation classes. Respite volunteers for caretakers, siblings, family members, etc. And then support groups for families. These are things that you can get started without any kind of monetary output at your church. And then, of course, who will be on your team? As you plan, who is going to be the coordinator? Who will coordinate all your existing ministries with the needs of those living with disabilities to ensure their active involvement and participation in those ministries? Who will be your volunteers? Try not to have parents involved because they like to control things and they won't get any respite. And so you're looking at it from both sides, as you want to be able to make sure that those parents who do like to control things will not cause issues for those who are not their kids. And then also you want to make sure that they get a chance to get some respite. Again, if you are not clergy, is your clergy on board? Are they part of the team? Do you understand what might be keeping them from getting on board? I don't think I've met any clergy who are against this, but at least not in this diocese. And but again, if I haven't met everybody, so if you know, just ask your clergy what might be going on, because that's a good conversation to have. Oops. So getting everyone ready. This is the training portion. Before you begin training, you should ensure that everyone who will volunteer is committed to learning from mistakes. We all make them and we all continue to make mistakes. But once we know better, we do better. And, you know, as I mentioned earlier, we have a litany of healing that I just realized the other day had some wording that I think would probably be best to be rewritten. And so everyone should know, we are going to make mistakes, but let's go ahead and, we should not have thin-skinned people being volunteers. So language, some areas of training. There's a PDF link later in the resources slide, and I will point that out, but it tells you the top 10 things that, in terms of language, what you should not say, what you should say, how you should interact with people, etc. That'll come up in the slide in a bit. You should always train people how to interact with anybody's mobility equipment. And then the basic understanding of all the various disabilities that are present in your own church and in your community, so that you know what to be prepared for if people come to visit, and how to interact in that particular situation. Having a job description for your volunteers makes it easy for people to determine if they would like to volunteer for a particular ministry. It should clearly help them answer the question of, what are my responsibilities? It should tell them who they report to, and you should do volunteer on the job training. You should show them the role from start to finish, what to expect, where to find things, and how to interact with people. You should train both your clergy and the congregation. Everyone who will interact with those living with disabilities should get some form of training. At the very least, you should provide a space where people can ask questions, because your goal is to build understanding and compassion, so that we never allow ourselves to let someone feel unwelcome in our parishes. And then finally, once you've done all of that, you can launch your program. But this is where people get stuck a lot of times. They've done all this planning and then they don't launch. And the reason for that is you might become afraid that every possible scenario that you have prepared for will all happen at the same time, causing some indecision or well, just fear that it's just too much. Or that you are afraid that you do not have the resources you think you need, or that nobody will come despite all the work you've put into it. But I can guarantee you that if you don't start, if you don't even launch, no one will come. So always start slow. You've asked your target audience, you know what the main needs are, and so tackle one item at a time. So.
Okay, next up, we'd like to open to questions and comments that you have. Do you have specific questions about us and our experiences, or how we feel, or what was brought up in the webinar?
I'm sorry, I had to turn my camera off and stuff for a minute, because as always in the diocese, something is blowing up, and when the chancellor calls you, you answer. But I think you guys did a survey in which there were a lot of responses from around the diocese about needs, and hearing was like overwhelmingly number one. So I'm wondering if you, assuming I didn't miss that part when I was out, can you say a little bit more about what it was that we learned that people were experiencing in our diocese currently?
Yeah, I think, was it Mary Lou or Denny? You were working with James and Sandy on the hearing
Yes.
response. And I forgot, can you elaborate on that?
Well, I brought it forth, and well, we had a meeting with a rep, and he came up with some good ideas, but the price that he quoted was in the thousands of dollars. And when I brought it back to our parish, it was like, no, I don't think we want to do that. So right now we're just sort of sitting around doing nothing about it.
So one of the things that we
Okay.
had come and figured out was that there are, various forms of dealing with the hearing issue. There's the loop systems, which are the most expensive, but apparently the most advanced. And then there are the like radio transmitters, infrared transmitters, which plug directly into your sound system and go to transmitters. A lot of people, it turns out, do not wish to be seen wearing headphones
Right.
in church.
You.
So, but those are the other options. They're considerably cheaper than the looping system. And then there is the system that, we purchased here at St. Albans, which is it plugs into your soundboard, and it's a router. It allows people to install an app on their phone and then use their earbuds or other, even hearing aids these days have Bluetooth connections. And so it allows people to be a little more stealthy in the fact that they are using hearing assistance. And it's the cheapest. It has some drawbacks, but it only costs about $650. So those were the options. The looping system, I think, can actually get up into the $10,000 range.
Right.
That price has really gone down on that. In fact, we changed vendors. And after what Denny had told us, we did, and it got another vendor, and then the tech that we have at St. Barnabas came out and then also surveyed the church, and it seems to me that was going to be an installation of a looping system would be less than $500.
Wow.
So it's really gone down, but don't quote me exactly on it because it's worth looking into. It by far is the best way. All Saints is looped. At St. Barnabas's church is looped, and Christ Church has he's figured it out with another parishioner and the microphone system, so they're doing much better there. There's so much more being done for the hard hearing now than ever before. It's another silent handicap. You look fine, but
Right.
you feel really stupid a lot of times. So I'd be glad to help with any of the different people that I know around the valley that can do it.
I see that we have a question from Tony Murdoch.
She actually just answered it. If you have vendors that you can share with other churches, just if they have any way to get quotes, just to see what the church's capability is for funding it, like they might be able to find other ways to work on that. I have a few people that have with the security grant that just happens to be one of their extra little niches, but I want to make sure that you all get that contact as well. So,
Oh,
so the
right.
vendor list.
We talked about getting a grant for money for different things, but largely the hearing. Was that ever made available, or did you research it?
Who are you asking that question?
I think I'm sorry. You're the one. I think you had mentioned that there were grants that could.
Well, so there are grants, and in the last episode of the Arizona Episcopalian, we had put a call for volunteers who are grant writers. But there are some grants available for various things, for various accessibility items throughout. That you can apply for your church, because there are organizations that offer grant money. However, we did not personally apply for a grant, and partly because we need grant writers. So, this is a nice appeal. If any of you know how to write grants and would like to write grants,
I don't know. Another thing that is necessary along with the hearing are when they have these small groups and they're all talking, they can't hear them. And so there's another system in which the microphone is passed around. And so they can be included in the small group discussion. The other thing you have to, for the clergy and so on, is to be sure that microphone is passed around in meetings. When different ones want to speak from the audience, most of the people can't hear them. And so stop and take that microphone to the speaker, and they learn that, well, I won't talk until I get the mic.
All right. I think, Macrina, you had a comment that that I asked you to bring up at the questions and comments section. Would you like to expand on that?
Sure, but I don't know which comment you're referring to.
Oh, it was just that you had some negative experiences in churches that kind of helped to. It was early on, but perhaps.
Yeah. Well, back in the dark. Well, let me do something first, and that is to say that I think it's important to undergird any effort for inclusion, toward inclusion, with theology and scripture. And the whole notion of being whole is not that we have all our limbs and both eyes and both ears and so on. It's a wholeness from within. When Jesus talks about being whole, that's what he means. And that's how I understand that particular prayer. I think that notion of wholeness needs to be applied to every human creature if we truly understand ourselves and each other to be made in the image of God. And unless we have that foundation on which to build, all of it's just problem solving. We can build a ramp, we can put in a hearing system and that kind of thing. But do we really truly believe that my brother, my sister is made in the image of God as I am made in the image of God? Are we truly whole? To illustrate that a little bit, perhaps, I would bring in a different kind of disability than what we've been discussing, and that is cognitive disabilities. Whether it's somebody with Tourette's or Down syndrome or autism or whatever it might be. Decline. Yep. Decline, dementia, brain injury. I mean, all of these things happen, and we have those people in our midst. We certainly have those people on the fringe. Speaking from personal experience of our son and different people who came into our congregation, it's incredibly difficult for some of these folks to go to church and find a welcome, because if they don't know how to participate, if they're unable to participate, if they participate with a little more vocalization than some of our very proper Episcopalians would like, they're not welcome. And the ugly story I referenced goes back to probably right around 1980 in this diocese, in this city, Phoenix. One of the large parishes had a rector who was married, and their son has autism. And some ladies of the congregation went to the rector expressing their concern that he didn't sit still and he wouldn't be quiet. And the rector sided with those ladies and not with his wife and son. They were asked to leave the church. They're still here, so I'm not naming names. Jennifer, if you want to know, we can talk. But, that should never happen. What made it possible for us to include Callum when Michael started at the parish in Leavenworth, Kansas, was two things. our attitude that he belonged based on an understanding of made in the image of God. And we'd had a lot of conversation about that before and after he was born. We were really challenged in coming to grips with that. But also, certain members of the congregation reached out to us, recognizing that I was going to church essentially as a single parent because he was the one who was the rector. And I had two small boys the same age, and they were going different directions, and I just couldn't keep up. So we had members of the congregation step up and step in and be responsible for helping with our boys every Sunday, sometimes picking them up from home and taking them through the McDonald's drive-in to get a Happy Meal before church, sometimes taking them after church to give me time to catch my breath, sitting with them in during the service, walking them around during the service, talking with some of the older people who said they should just sit down and be quiet, and saying, no, they don't need to do that. Going to bat for them. That made all the difference. And I think in terms of being an inclusive community, an awful lot of what we need to do is advocate for the people in our midst, make it possible for them to find a welcome, not just in the technology, not just in the wheelchair ramp, not just in those kinds of things, all of which are important, but in the attitudes and the understanding we have of what it means to be created in the image of God.
Yeah, and I appreciate you bringing that up, because that was what I was trying to reference. I think you made it much more clear than I did. And that was what I was trying to bring up, in that the parish, the people in the church need to understand this. And it needs to come from the pulpit. It needs to come in all your advertisements, whatever you put out, that everyone is in the image of God and is welcome. And until we get that integrated or ingrained in people's hearts and minds, it's very hard to make sure that everyone feels welcome.
May I throw in a couple of things? One is that we need to be oriented to the notion that when anyone steps into our congregation, Christ is in the house. And that we have something to learn from each one. And until we get to that sense of value and reverence for each life in our midst, we're kind of going to make mistakes. So that's just one thing. The other thing, I want to recommend a book by Stephanie Spellers, Radical Welcome. It's not talking so much about welcoming people with other sets of abilities and disabilities, but it's about how to bring the stranger into the congregation, and how the congregation changes because that person's there. Because that's really every new person affects the community, whether they look like me or not. And every new person is welcome and needs to be engaged as Christ. And I don't know, I could I've stopped preaching and gone to meddling, but I'll be done. Sorry.
All right. Well, if any of you would like to join us, I know we're a little over time now. And so if any of you need to go or want to go, please feel free. If you are interested in joining the Disability Concerns Committee, our email address is disabilityconcerns@azdiocese.org. Also, this is the resources slide. So the online, the 10 disability etiquette, Joni and Friends is Joni Erickson Tata is an evangelical she dove into a river or a lake and became quadriplegic, and she has been working for disability inclusion for most of her life now. One of the books that I did not mention, and I'm glad that you brought up Stephanie Speller's book, but one good book in terms of theology and in thinking of how everyone is in the image of God and teaches us something is Henry Nouwen's book, Adam. And that is not included in my book list here, but that is one that I definitely recommend reading for that theological standpoint. Any final questions before we
I just wanted to make a note about accessibility of sacraments. So the church I was the rector of in New York City had a family where an elderly woman lived with her adult son who had some sort of disability, not quite sure what. But one of his siblings came and took them to church most of the time. And it was only after I had been there for like 10 years that I discovered that he, a man in probably aged late 50s, 60s, had never been confirmed. All of his siblings had been confirmed. They had all gone to that church their entire lives, never got confirmed. And, I assume at some point there was a sort of discussion of, oh, well, he can't learn or whatever it is that he's supposed to get to be confirmed. So, he got confirmed at the Cathedral of St. John the Divine. And I have said there's Christ the King here in Tucson. There's a young man who joined Christ the King with a developmental disability that he's an acolyte. He reads lessons. My mom works with him to help him when he's reading to like get him ready so that he can lead something. But he then got confirmed. And then because his parents had given up on church when he was born because they had a bad experience regarding his baptism, I guess, in some church, left the church, didn't go to the church again, any church again, until he decided he wanted to go to church. He found Christ the King. He came, and then his parents followed him. And so I ended up confirming his parents as well. So welcoming people with disabilities is not just welcoming them, it's welcoming their whole families. And it's actually evangelism in a very constructive way. And so for people, it's not just the theology, and it's not just trying to live up to the Episcopal Church welcomes all. And it's not just it's smart too. So I mean, different people respond to different things, right? And so for people who want to hear stories like that, where it's like, this is and it's also reparations and healing for the sins of the past. You can't fix the past, but you can at least not repeat the same sins of the past. And so, I hope, I'm grateful for this group starting this conversation or continuing this conversation. I know it's not new in this diocese, but excited for what can happen so that more people can experience the love of God in prayer and in service and in sacrament and in their lives. So thank you.
Thank you. I think this concludes our webinar. If you have any other questions and would like to stay on, we'll be happy to try and answer them. Otherwise, have a wonderful evening.
Great.
Thank you all. Good night.
Yep.
Thank you all.
Thank you for your organization and the